here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang co-chairs on Tuesday the 11th round of high-level strategic dialogue between China and the EU with Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. That's after Vice Premier Han Zheng stressed the consensus of deepening green cooperation in a previous meeting with European leaders via video link. China has taken another big and practical step in pushing for renewable power. At the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced that China will step up support for other developing countries in tapping into green and low-carbon energy and ruled out building new coal-fired power projects abroad. With these Chinese green initiatives, will it help steer the world economy towards a more sustainable and inclusive growth? How could China and the EU better collaborate in dealing with pressing global challenges? Our panelists spoke about that. For more on the latest interaction between China and the European Union in Brussels, Nicholas White, Senior Director of APCO's Brussels office. In Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you first. Well, a lot of things are going on in the world, and it seems that China and the EU want to talk to one another. That certainly is good news, isn't it, Mr. White?
Oh, absolutely. Dialogue is much better than conflict, although, of course, one can have both dialogue and conflict in different realms. But it's very clear that there is an agenda for cooperation between China and the EU. It's also very clear that in an increasingly multipolar world, China is an important and powerful entity, and the European Union is an important and powerful entity. And we're all better when these people are in a stage of structured communication to identify common interests and common problems.
According to the latest readout from the interaction between the Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang and his counterpart with the EU side has been talking about how a frame the China relationship. The EU officials suggest it is a matured, multifaceted, non-confrontational relationship in which close and smooth communications are needed. What are those adjectives mean to you, Mr. Bruckner?
I think what it says is that we are not on a confrontational path. What we have seen 2 weeks ago, that the United States, Australia, and the UK joined a strategic military-oriented agreement. This is different from what the European Union tries to continue, which has always been multifaceted in the sense of we have so many common issues to discuss that it wouldn't help if we flex muscles or we show tools from hard power, and we rather keep all the channels open for trust and multilateralism and everything it needs to address the challenges of the 21st century.
What about that for you, Mr. White? All these adjectives.
I think some of them are descriptive and some are aspirational. It is true that this is a multifaceted relationship, but it's also somewhat limited. China and the European Union have got very strong interests in common business dealings, building up joint economic ventures. They've got a very, very strong interest in cooperating on climate change. Both the EU and China are very strong advocates for the need to adapt. They have areas of joint interest, but not necessarily cooperation in international development, particularly in terms of bringing economic development to Africa. And that's an area where we have seen competition between the two. It is possible to imagine a more cooperative relationship. However, we have also seen a certain amount of conflict. We've seen a dispute between China and Lithuania, which may be a small European member state, but it's still a member state. and there's been a dispute between the two of them over the Taipei issue. And I think that is an indicator that although Mr. Borrell, the EU chief diplomat, may say that he would like the relationship to be non-confrontational, that's not always the way it's going to be.
People are asking, generally speaking, the leadership of this generation, whether they are more transactional or they are more forward-looking. I think that's a question also needs to be asked to the European leaders, particularly Mr. Buchner, with Angela Merkel, one of the well-respected leaders in the EU, likely to leave the political stage. Whether the others will be able to shoulder the responsibility, how they are going to perform about the role of Europe rather than being anybody's follower. So, Mr. Buchner, how do you see that?
I like the term likely to leave because we are still forming a coalition in Germany.
That's true.
And nobody knows how long it's going to take until Merkel will finally have a chance to retire. But to be more serious, I think everyone who could potentially form a coalition in Germany, and I think that also counts for the other leaders in the European Union, are equally committed to multilateralism and to, I wouldn't say a transactional definition of what our relationship is. It will always be a combination of values and principles and norm-based definitions of what we want, what do we want, and what do we stand for, and also what is in our mutual interest. And therefore, such dialogues are of utmost importance to understand what has changed and who represents what and where are the differences compared with, let's say, a year ago or the situation before the pandemic. If we don't understand what are the domestic constraints, both in China and in the European Union, we will make mistakes that we can avoid by keeping the communication channels open.
Mr. White, what about that question for you?
China is a very important world power. The EU is a very important world power. So in order to lead, there is no choice but to engage in dialogue. Now, the question is on what terms? And I thought you put it quite well in putting the dichotomy between being forward-looking or being transactional. There is no need that you cannot have both. I think that a forward-looking relationship necessarily is transactional as well. If we're looking at, for instance, the international development situation, that is a policy that by its very nature is forward-looking. It's about improving the economy in countries in the developing world so that they too will become rich and be able to participate as equals in the global economy. So it's forward-looking, but it's also very transactional because it's about building up links between the donor community, the developed economies, and those countries that are not yet in that category.
Mr. Buchner, let me also ask you about that. How do you see, European politics, particularly Europe as a whole, used to present to the world of one with principle? And it has been, in fact. And it is, the founder of the modern political systems and many other things. So, Mr. Buchner, do you see the leaders together these days will be able to answer, once again, that historic question and that historic responsibilities?
Well, to come back to the previous one, I think it helps if we don't call it transactional, but focus on the utilitarian side of international relations. And if we ignore that there are interests and we have to respect the interest-driven motivation of doing something and believe that everything is perfectly driven by ideas and principles, then we miss the point. There's sometimes this bias in German foreign policy that we believe that multilateralism is an aim in itself and that it's not used as a tool by others to maximize their gains. So thinking that now the Trump years are over and the Biden administration is not interested in maximizing the interest for the United States would be utterly naive. And what we find in the European Union is a mishmash of different interests and why someone is a member of the European Union or why someone is supporting what Mr. Borrell is presenting as an EU-China strategy, there is still a widespread of different positions, and it's extremely hard for him to position himself and to define something like the long-term goals of the European Union in that respect.
For one more perspective, I'm joined also by Mr. Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair, Professor and Director of the Center for EU Studies with Renewable University of China. Professor Wang, your take.
Well, in the eyes of the Chinese, European Union represents a new kind of modern civilization of the human being, not just on the base of Asian European civilization. So we identify the China-EU relations of the two kinds of the civilizations relationship. Secondly, European Union definitely is a major driving forces of globalization. So it's a market, it's a technology, innovation, it's a normative power. So China-EU take a leading role, like in climate change, multilateralism. And thirdly, European Union also is a geopolitical player in the international society. So China-EU can cooperate in the Iranian nuclear negotiation and many other hot topics. So China and the EU relations, I think, go beyond of the China-US confrontation, have the independent of the approach.
Very interesting, the last sentence particularly, Professor Wang, when you said it is China's approach to the EU is independent from the latest realities of China-US relationship. Mr. White, you respond?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. The relationship is very different. The US and China have got potential security conflicts of interest. Let's be really frank about that. There are discussions about, you've already mentioned the Taiwan question. There's the question of the South China Sea. These are live issues for the United States, and they're not live issues for Europe. So the security element is going to be largely absent from the China-EU dialogue and present to a much greater degree in China's approach to the United States. The business side of things, I think, also plays out a bit differently because Europe is committed to a more open economy with a certain amount of hesitation, but still it's committed to a more open economy. And the United States is heading in a more protectionist direction.
Mr. Bruckner.
Well, even if we have all the reasons to discuss things from strictly the point of view of what are China's positions and interests and what a European Union wants, it's not independent from what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And in times in which the position of the United States, even after Trump, is more confrontational with China, we as partners in NATO and we as part of the Western world will be pushed to sideline with the United States and form a more pro-American position that affects the relationship between the European Union and China. And this is something not all political leaders in the European Union are happy with, but it will be the new reality that we have to deliver if partnership is more than a word.
But Mr. Bruckner, one crucial thing is whether the EU is believing that you always go with the precedents, or the EU needs to understand that there is a newer reality, somewhat at least, that is still brewing. Nobody knows where things are, in fact, at this point. So how will the EU, will that be able to just seek the earlier practice, which is mainly to be standing together with the United States on what the US believes as crucial issues? Or the EU is going to have a palatable relationship that will, with EU's core interest in mind, even though it is still very hard as things are moving on to figure out what exactly are the core interests of the EU. Mr. Bruckner.
Well, if the European Union would be a king and you ask this, would be a kingdom and you ask the king, how do you form the position in the situation that you just described? it would be a hard nut to crack. But coming back to what we discussed earlier about the domestic constraints of an organization of 27 different publics, at this given point, when we have Macron lobbying for a stronger European security position that can also be used to form an independent position independently from what the United States would like to see happening, we simply don't know in what direction we are moving. The German election campaign almost avoided a position on what is the stance of the different candidates who could become the successor of Merkel to form an opinion towards China, towards the future of NATO or a strategic autonomy of the European Union. And if we don't even know what the German position is, how can I read in my crystal ball what the future position of the European Union will be?
Well, Mr. Buchner is having a difficult time reading the current crystal ball he has on hand. What about for you, Professor Wang? Do you have another ball?
In the eyes of the Chinese, European Union is different with the United States. Firstly, the United States is a hegemonic power, which has, like Taiwan, South China Sea, direct confrontation with China. European Union, there's no any geopolitics confrontation with China, no historic remain questions. Secondly, United States, of course, is different with European Union, which has a military alliance system. So in Australia, the Philippines and Japan and South Korea, all these that China has to face up with. The European Union is not that case.
There are a lot of grand issues that we have discussed, but I have to focus also on some of the specific ones because they could tell the story to a certain extent. For example, climate change, one of the common themes between China and the EU. How is it going to be leveraged by both sides for a better cooperation relationship, while at the same time be able to help their domestic agenda for energy transition? That's an interesting issue. Another interesting issue about things like Afghanistan or Iran, these hot button issues. How will both sides work with one another? Will they be able to fulfill the vacuum that the Americans have left with? One could arguably speak that it is a bigger hole now over there than when they came in to Afghanistan, for example. And another thing is, how about the other issues that the world is facing right now, that the Americans with their own domestic politics, very busy, are hardly could have the energy and the willingness to deal with. What about China and the EU? So on these three areas, gentlemen, which do you think that China and the EU will be able to more constructively work on? One, climate change. Two, hot button issues. Third, issues that the US do not even have the willingness to care in the rest of the world. Would you choose one, two, or three? Mr. White, your choice.
Oh, climate change all the way. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Mr. Buchner, your choice.
I think all three are too important to just focus our energy on just one.
So you're saying, Mr. Buchner, all of the above, 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
All of the above.
Professor Wang, what about your choice?
Two. Firstly, it's about low carbon neutrality.
Okay.
Second is about digital partnership.
Okay. Well, everyone has your reasons, so please explain. Mr. White, you chose one.
Sure. I mean, climate change is an existential issue that threatens the future of the human race on this planet. And no serious politician, I mean, there are plenty of unserious politicians, but no serious politician can afford to ignore the challenge. From my view, both the EU and China have made some very positive statements on this in the last few weeks, few days, even at the UN General Assembly. We have the big climate conference coming up very shortly in Scotland. That's going to be a real turning point to show whether the world is serious about tackling this challenge. It looks to me like both China and the EU will be sending the right signals. Right. If I can speak about the other two questions you raised. Afghanistan is Afghanistan. It's its own problem. It's a neighbor of China, so China, of course, is going to be very interested in what happens there. It's not a neighbor of Europe, and provided that the internal affairs of Afghanistan do not disturb what is happening in Europe, it will be left alone.
All right. Professor Wang?
Well, low carbon because it's a post-industrial civilization. European Union take a leading role. However, China is very dynamic and strong cooperator and competitor with the European Union. China's market is so large, and China is a transfer from the high standard to match the local condition of the developing countries. China is a world factory, so the key to solve this problem. And the second, digital. China, we have Baidu, our own search engine, so we're independent. I just come back from Wuzhen World Internet Conference. So this transition from the industrial civilization to the digital civilization. European Union need to work together with China to have their own search engine. Then can have the AI and also a digital economy.
Professor Bruckner, you heard your partners. So your thoughts? You chose 1, 2, 3, and all of the above.
Well, the reason why I answered like this is that it's not just a question of what is the most important problem and do we have to force attention to just one. It's also a matter of perception. And China has been very successful in nation branding, whether it's likable or whether it appears as a potential rival, which is also part of the communication strategies within countries. Like, look at the Trump administration, how it turned China into the evil empire, replacement of what used to be the Soviet Union. So I don't think that all of the problems that you mentioned, and we could add more of them, don't go away if we just focus on one. So if China manages to win the hearts and minds of Europeans by doing something that is very high on the priority list in Europe, for example, moving away from coal, then it appears as a country that takes climate change policies so seriously that we can also trust the country in areas that are currently seen as more controversial. And even if Afghanistan is no longer high on the priority list, or to put it bluntly, we utterly failed there, and there is no appetite to go on any similar adventure anytime soon, we will see growing conflicts on the Belt and Road Initiative side effects that also need something like a common denominator where we address the problems that come from conflicting interests or the principle-driven definitions of what the problem is in a certain situation. So the more we develop cooperation in all the mentioned areas and even more, the more we find a solution that is not confrontational.
I really enjoyed the conversation, even though sometimes our conversation go a little bit abstract, but I think that's exactly what we need now. Not necessarily just daily transactional thinking, but forward-looking strategies and interactions. I want to thank the three of you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Nicholas White and Ulrich Bruckner, Wang Yiwei. Thank you so much.